First of all, it's functional, because one of the issues that we initially had to understand was we can't just change everything overnight. And it isn't always the software engineers you want to have in the room. It's also to understand the key project managers. You also want to understand from the salespeople side. We've got as many people together to basically understand not just the monolith, but the ways of working. And the monolith enigma stayed here. It was tightly coupled code, seemingly insurmountable and paired growing databases to the point where it was one main database, one main app, not sustainable for a growing company. So we started using event storming. And before I continue, has anyone here worked and done event storming before? Cool. 1, 2, 3. That's my boss. Hi. And how do we actually achieve that? Well, frankly, what we initially discovered off the bat was that we had to understand, first of all, what it was. Not us from that day to day, because we actually were lucky enough to actually work with Chris Simon, as some of you may also have worked with him in the past. We actually got through and reflected a lot on Chris Simon's initiative on that, because he was the first person on this project with us. And we had to address the main elephant in the room. It's like, what platform do we build? Do we go serverless? Do we go containers? So our first point was to address the skill set of the developers there. We found that the initial application and the language that was written in, I believe, we found that their move to Python was the right choice for both infrastructure and code. So this is before getting into the event storming side. It was understanding boundaries, limitations, as well as a preference of moving to choice. We found that event storming was really akin to the blueprint of the software. Once we actually started the ball rolling and once we understood the system, it ended up looking like this. Now, I think some of you might think like, great, that gives me flashbacks to time before Jira and now currently Jira, where you just had a bunch of tasks everywhere. Instead, what we actually did is, this is what event storming actually started looking like. When we look to the left, and for those of you at home that can zoom in, congratulations. The ones that are here can't. We actually started breaking down their function. We'd basically start by going, let's have a basic introduction where we go, let's go through a sales order. Walk into the store, step 1, approach the counter, pick your item, cash register goes through, money gets put away. Let's translate that into your app. We started breaking down and looking at their monolith, and they had a Java monolith, which they were, funnily enough, moving to Python. And for those that are going to be saying that, you know, Python might be slower or Java is still great, it worked for them, so we went for the right choice there. And we started breaking down further. We started looking at those direct functions, not from the code itself, but from what they understood was going to be the final answer. And so we took apart one of the main, which was basically a constant communication from one of the ships back to a central point. And we understood that the way they did it, that they had, whether it be IoT devices or whether they had another onboard system that was feeding back an API call. So we started breaking it down. It's like, okay, what was the entry point? API gateway. All right, cool. We'll consider an API gateway. What did that lead to? To invoke something. Well, what were the things you'd invoke? And this is where we start bringing down that ubiquitous language. We haven't gotten to grouping just yet. And we went beyond that. We started looking at both the developers and analysts and domain experts to kind of give us their understanding. That was the first 2 days. We hadn't put any solutioning in. It was really to understand the full design that they had from 20 years of experience in a week. I can comfortably say that having Chris Simon there was a huge help. After we'd had spent the first couple of days, we started looking at groupings. And this is where we started to understand, how does each of the components you've built up separate from each other, and how can we actually map them? Because one of the key issues we pointed out earlier was the database. And if I can go back, a massively growing database. So we started tracing those paths and we started separating out those individual domains between each of them, whether it be a domain in a function that they understood, which was domains from a grouping of compute, data, and ingress, or whether it be from a business function perspective. And as you might have guessed, developers, they went on the route of implementation and solution, while analysts understood business function better. But having those 2 people in the room, 3 if you included domain experts, really made things progress. If you just have technical, you're only going to achieve the technical. And 90% of the time when you approach event storming, you're trying to do a business solution. The technical comes afterwards. And this is how it actually started splitting into domains. You can see that this was quite messy, right? From a first glance, doesn't look like much is happening there besides, you know, a bit of organized chaos. Well, we started filtering that through. We started separating out and going through different policies, you know, aggregators, commands, and users, separating out external systems, events, and then finally risks and questions. And what we actually started doing, and if you look at in the middle there, so for those at home, you'll see that we have many ingress points going through. And for those here, just quickly, you'll find that what we actually started doing was taking our initial design we had here, progressing it through to the next extent. Where we started actually breaking down the business functions and finally going into an application, well, something that resembles an application. And then with the blueprint in hand, mind you, again, we didn't solution anything at that point yet. We had gone through and, oh, sorry, just a big bug. And we've actually started to get ourselves the blueprints on how we can actually get to those microservices. And then off we went. From that point, we found that everything they actually had created was asynchronous. At that point, we went down the event-driven route. We found that Lambda was perfectly great for them. We went down the Lambda route. They went serverless. From a build perspective and a cost perspective, things started to drop off, and the developer workflow increased too, because we started introducing ubiquitous language. Not only was their functions written in Python, now was the infrastructure as code. So both developer and operations spoke the same language. And they decided to keep us around. So after we had actually went through that initial blueprint to dissect everything, build out the business functions, and then start deploying and building product A, product B, product C, more and more engagements came from that. And we empowered. Because what we found was that you can solution as much as you want, but without actually understanding the business functions. And we wouldn't have understood the business functions the way we know them today if we went for event storming. Because you break it down really to the finer points of section A, section B, section, Q through to Z. And when we finally came to microservices, it was self-contained, it was understandable, and it was ready for exploration. It was easy for us to build afterwards because we went event-driven. Ubiquitous language meant that we could actually ubiquitous language plus the domain groupings that we had. We could actually work with their data engineers to separate out the databases. We went NoSQL. We went Dynamo. So we went, again, serverless and scalable. And for those who may have picked up on it, inadvertently, would save a lot of money in the cloud. We went to a model which was pay on demand rather than 24/7. We found that per use went from tens of thousands of dollars a month to several hundred to sometimes 1,000, depending on how busy things were. But the calls didn't drop. Instead, what happened is the model improved. And this is where modernization kind of kicks in. And we had a clear path forward from there. So with the monolith transforms, the structured microservices created, everything was ready to move on to the next steps. So we had some cleaner code. We didn't have any legacy or debt tech debt to begin with because we've decided to throw it away. And what we found is that blueprint that I spoke about earlier led to another engagement, and their ongoing costs reduced. So when you compare a bill in the cloud of hundreds of thousands of dollars to maybe tens of thousands of dollars, that's a massive saving and a much happier group of developers. And because they've moved to a more modern language, more modern framework, to take away from the event storming side for a second, they found it a lot easier to hire. I don't think anyone here wants to work on Fortran, do they? Didn't think so. But yeah, that's the presentation. Short and sweet. Darren's going to come up next. Any questions before we continue?
Do events normally in person? Or
in person. Yeah. So, well, actually, no, combination. Fahad, I think it was a combination of both, wasn't it?
The majority of it was in person.
Majority was in person, yeah.
Chris was remote.
Yeah.
So Chris Simon, who's organized previously, he was facilitating it. So he was
So for those of you at home, we had actually been most of the time in person, except for Chris. But the value of Chris remote may as well have been two Chris's in person.
Having said that, the subsequent, once you have the first one completed, the subsequent event storms with the customer were all remote and a lot easier to get through. And we used Miro to do the whole thing. So
yeah,
it worked out pretty well.
So going forward from there, my initial engagements were in person, but all the remote ones and our ongoing engagements with OMC, for example, have proven that you can definitely do it remotely. But being in person The reality is it does break that initial barrier. You put a very human face to what you're trying to achieve, where it's a lot easier to deal with once you're on Google Meets or Teams or whatever else have you. Basically create it more scalable. The idea was correct. You could imagine that if you're working on a traditional model where, let's just say, you can't scale horizontally, you're scaling only vertically. There's a certain period of time through scale that you need to decide that if you're earning, let's just say, dollars per hour, you're stopping that time. So you're losing money during that time because you can't scale horizontally. We created a system that was event-driven, that is on demand, and then just happened to be cheaper in the long run. The solution may have actually been something potentially more costly, but the scalability of the actual solution would have more than paid for itself. But we went down the route which was manageable.
You have to rewrite every single module in different language, or you combine together to make it more streamlined.
That was one of the two options. We could have went down the straggler figure out where we would have kept the monolith around and slowly but surely moved away into using microservices. In this case, it was basically from memory. This was some time ago. It was a complete cutover. We had rewritten everything in Python. And we found that even though the language, although people love to say, oh, Python is not as performant, it's usually the developer hasn't written it right. It's not so much the language. And rewriting wasn't the difficult part because we understood business function. Business function meant is whichever way we executed it met what they required. We didn't have to rely on legacy. Sometimes for once, it's actually easier to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Not that you should ever throw out your baby. Don't do it. Yep.
When you were evaluating how much of their own solution to implement versus like maybe you have biases that you like to work with or the team likes to work with, calculating that solution works for them versus actually this is stopping a lot of potential profit happening. Like how do you balance that?
So the question was, how do we balance our biases? Because, well, firstly, we were lucky enough that the decided platform of choice was AWS. So for us, being a AWS consulting shop, it was easy to kind of go down that route. The one thing you got to realize with event storming is throw out your biases, throw out your ego, and just try to focus on the right solution at hand. We funnily enough found that we were in a group of developers following development standards, and basically the choice became clear that serverless was right. We didn't want to introduce the overhead that Kubernetes and other platforms can provide. We provided what was the easiest way to speak in a language, both on the development side as well as the business side, that everybody could understand, and going that event-driven and serverless route, because their architecture was effectively event-driven, but it wasn't mapped out as such. Just because you have a monolith doesn't mean you're not event-driven in a way, right? Then cohersively, we found that they were very understanding of the Lambda workflow. We had the right engineers. We had the right principals, like Dan Lorenzen, who spoke in Melbourne and is actually the principal consultant on this project going forward, who could give them a guiding hand as well. I think there's an issue with how consultancies can approach projects of this nature, where it's basically, we've modernized, now we're gone. Part of the approach should always be that if you are going to provide a modern and unique and event-driven architecture, you need to also provide the upskilling, because there's no value to what we did if we just gave them something they can't look after. Yeah. Yep.
Was there a team in terms of the number of developers now?
The question was, how big was the developers or the team? I will get back to you on that one, and chat, I'll get back to you too. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. It was anywhere from about 12 to 15 from memory, but I'll post the answer in chat and I'll come back to you later. And I think we've got time for one more. Hi, Chris.
There's a question from live stream.
Yep.
How do you estimate how long conversations can take?
Well, you know, there is always the answer of like, how long is a piece of string? But you'll quickly find that we found that a week was well. And the reason why was basically we set up agendas for each one. But the problem is you can set an agenda, but whether you follow agenda is another thing. Because what happens is tangents will come up. People get very passionate about particular choices in the way that things were done or how a business process should run. And again, I'd love to focus on the application side here, but no, we're going to focus on the business focus side. Because analyst A may have a different idea from developer B, who the project manager goes, no, this is how it shouldn't be done. Getting people to come to that single point of we believe X should be achieved. You may find that your event storming process to get the business functions down could take 3 days. But then the actual grouping and then the actual solution design side may take only half that time. So I would say typically, if you're going through this sort of process, pick a small application to work on. Don't pick a giant monolith to kind of break down. I'd say the bigger the app, the longer the period of time. So 4 to 8 days for being conservative. I think that's pretty much it. Thanks, everyone. I think next we have Darren.